This video is on the powers of I. I did pull this from the page 34 in Algebra 2 book. I think it does a great job of going through the pattern. I want to talk it through with you. I to the 0 equals 1. Anything raised to the 0 power is itself. So there's the first one. And then I to the 1, remember what I represents. I equals the square root of -1, an imaginary number. Then we learned that an I times an I is I squared, or the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 is the square root of -1 squared, which is -1. That's why that's the case. The last one, I cubed. I cubed can be broken down into I squared times I. What you can do is you can replace this I squared with -1. So you'd have -1, and then I, which is -I. And then we have I to the 4th. I to the 4th is the same thing as I squared times I squared. If you look up here, I squared is -1. So -1 times -1 is 1. What happens is we start to see this pattern continue on. So it starts off with 1, I, -1, -I. Then it repeats. So these 4 pieces are the pattern, and then it repeats over again. So then we'd have 1, I, -1, -I. Then the pattern repeats again. I'll just change the color. 1, I, -1, -I. And then the pattern repeats. 1. On this second slide, there isn't a pattern, but we're going to use that pattern to help us. So we want to say, what is the reduced form of -3i to the 12th? What does that represent? So I'm going to break apart the -3 by itself, and then I have I to the 12th. And we're going to just work with that I to the 12th. So I'm going to bring down this -3 again. And I'm going to split up I to the 12th as I squared to the 6th power. Now over here, if you remember, what does I squared represent? It represents -1. So I can replace that with a -1. And then I have it still raised to the 6th power. And then the -3 is still out in front. Now we do our PEMDAS with our exponent. -1 times -1 times -1 times -1. Continue on to the 6th power. A negative raised to the 6th power will always become a +1. And then we have that -3 out in front. -3 times +1 is -3. Example B, I to the 25th. We want to find out what that answer is. So we're going to break it apart as I times I to the 24th. So if you remember, you can break apart exponents with adding those. So I'm going to break apart again that I to the 24th as I squared to the 12th power. Then I have I to the 1. Remember again, note, I squared equals -1. So I can replace this -1 in for I squared. So negative 1 replaces the I squared, and I still have it raised to the 12th, and then I have that I out in front. Now negative 1 raised to the 12th power, anything raised to its even power, that negative becomes a positive 1. This is a positive 1, and I have that I out in front. Multiply those two things together, and we get I times 1, which is 1I, or just I. And that's how you can simplify higher order powers.